Welcome to another chat with Avid. Jack, it's always good to see you on a kind of gloomy Tuesday.
Yeah, good to see you.
So what we're going to talk about today is something that we have, we talk about this all the time. I think if anything, over the last couple of years anyway, we've had tons of conversations around this. And this is really a discussion about renting versus owning. So I know the pros and cons of that, the devil's advocate. You might be surprised at some of the things we have to say, because I think the norm would be renting's throwing your money away. And I think we have some points to make that are going to juxtapose that, because there are some benefits to renting as opposed to owning. So it's a huge topic. Where do you want to start?
I think it would be a couple of things. One would be that the rent versus buy thing, it seems to me anyways, it starts to take on a little bit of like a religious zeal between the things. It's like almost like two warring factions of people, where I'm not a renter, or those kinds of things. When you're not a renter because you rent a place, no more than you're a mortgage haver if you own a house, right? So they're just financial decisions to be made. If you rent a house, you're just a person that lives in a rented house or apartment, whatever it is. And if you buy a house, you're just a person that lives in a house and you have a mortgage. It doesn't transform you into a different person. It's just a financial decision. And being that it's a financial decision, it is good to at least give it consideration before you, let's say, buy a house, because it is a huge commitment to do that, versus maybe, I guess, renting is a little bit more flexible, whereas if you get into it and it's not working, you just kind of stop. There's no harm in getting out. Whereas buying is obviously it's a much bigger commitment. And it can be, there's just so much terminology, even just, I guess it's not even buying a house. It's the thing, it's getting the financing to buy a house that can be confusing. So I guess first thing is, there is no warring factions. This is not a value judgment on who you are versus what you're doing. So I think that's the first thing to say. The other thing is that this should be, like anything else, a decision based on what you're trying to accomplish and the things that are important to you. So we'll talk about this in a minute, but if you're kind of comparing apples to apples and buying something that's going to cost X, which is usually going to be more than it is to rent, typically, at least now, what are you giving up to do that? And if what you're giving up is something that is important to you, well, maybe you revisit the decision. And if you're giving up something that doesn't really matter to you, or you're free to give it up and you're willing to, then maybe you should do it. So it's more like we've talked about in other videos, where the objectives should lead the actions instead of the actions, and then jamming your objectives into the actions that you've taken. Because once we'll talk about decision making in a second. So I think those are kind of some caveats to start with, I think.
I think it's a good point. I think there's some things in there to talk about. I will say this: if you're maybe watching for the first video or something, our dynamic as it stands is my wife and I, we have two kids, 4 and 6, Clay and Lou, that we own a home. We're a mortgage haver and a piece of property. Right. We were in a condo and moved out about 5 years ago. And Jack, you probably know, is a renter. So I think part of this discussion too is our ability to conversate back and forth between the two of us with kind of no holds barred. I don't judge Jack for renting. He doesn't think I'm any better or worse from owning a home, but our perspectives absolutely have been enhanced over the last 4 or 5 years. I can say that for sure as a homeowner, and all of the things that go into it. And I think it really hits home with your first point was, what are you trying to do, right? What's the objective? For my wife and I, we wanted to have space for our kids, and we were in a little condo, and we wanted a yard and all those things that we felt would be important to raise a family. And that was kind of leading the decision. Financially, we can talk about that in a minute, but that helps our situation. If Jack, one of the things that you and Jessica like to do is, I guess pre-COVID, but do some traveling, right?
Yeah. Right.
And it's a lot more difficult. I think one of the biggest things, if I were to give it like a label or a category, is the time commitment to being a homeowner it's hard to put on paper. It's not an equation. It really is a commitment and somewhat of a lifestyle if you care about maintaining it, which ultimately does help kind of retain some of the value, which is a enticing part of homeownership, having some sort of, tangible asset that you could sell at some point.
Yeah. I think, you mentioned the renting is throwing money away, which is, it's a very common trope, I guess, that if you're renting, somehow you're throwing money away, which of course you're not. Maybe that's it's coming from the renter guy. Maybe that's why you would think that's the case, but it really isn't. You're getting something for what you're paying. You're no more throwing your money away renting than you are throwing your money away buying food. And you're getting something in exchange for doing it. You could say, well, if you're renting, you could buy something. And then, like Dave said, you have an asset at the end of it, or something like that, which is certainly true. We can have the discussion, and I think it's probably good just to go through, like, what should your expectations be for, the quote unquote investment returns of owning a home. And it's usually pretty low, which is okay. It probably will not end up being a good investment, especially compared to other things that you could do with the money, but that's fine. I think we get too wrapped up in this is an investment. Not everything has to be an investment. Like, if obviously you should invest your money, save and invest your money, which obviously we're always talking about, but not everything has to be an investment. Sometimes you're just spending money, and that's fine. Now, so if you're buying a house, it's a more likely than not, it's just a consumption. You're just spending money. It's an expense, and that's fine. You're getting something in return for doing that. It's probably not much of an investment return, but you're probably getting something for it. No different than really renting. I'm getting something for what I'm spending. And if I decide I want to do something else, I'll do something else. But in the meantime, I get a roof over my head, and I have a dedicated maintenance team that takes care of all the things that I don't want to bother with. I mean, I'm paying for that, and I get it and I use it. So You're not really throwing money away. You're spending money, you're consuming it, and that's just fine.
Yeah. And I would say, I think in our current state where you have low interest rates, home values are up, there's a lot of talk about the investment component of it. And normally we're, at least through our experience walking through people in terms of analyzing real estate, which is a whole nother, we'll probably do another one of these chats of just, how you analyze real estate and all that stuff. But it does sometimes start with, well, what can I afford? So you talk to a banker, you talk to a mortgage person, which are vital people to have in buying a home. But I believe, even in my own experience, not enough detail goes into what are the other things to be aware of financially that impact the home ownership. So if you're thinking about buying a home, or you've already started the process, some of those things outside of mortgage, principal and interest, right? That's pretty much your payment. You have taxes and insurance, and depending on where you live, those are going to vary. They more than likely are going to go up. In fact, this past year, as a homeowner, insurances have gone up considerably. That's a factor. I already mentioned time, but then the other component is just maintenance. And I would believe, and I've owned a home back in Ohio, that it's very difficult to pre-plan for either known or unknown expenses, right? And the longer you live there, the more those are going to happen, but it's money you have to spend for it.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to know. Well, we can say that here's the expectation. So usually what we would say is, 1.5% of the home's value is kind of an annual maintenance expense. Now, of course, that's an average. You're not going to spend that every month like clockwork. You're going to nothing will happen for a while, and then the AC goes and it's $5,000 or something, right? Who knows? I don't even know how much it costs now. $10,000.
Right.
It's expensive.
About 8, yeah.
Yeah. So that goes. Or like you and I always joke, you have these wood shelves in your house, and you see these little shavings, and you think, oh, termite, somebody comes in. No, some rare beetle that's impossible to kill, and you got to put there's things that you're just not going to expect.
Right. And that caveat, that's a true story.
Yeah,
That
right.
happens to our wood shelves, so we're not making this up. And yeah, it was about $350
Right.
as opposed to replacing other shelves. And that's an unplanned, unexpected expense, which if you're setting money aside, which is very difficult to do, maybe you could say, no, it's not a big deal, but it's money that you spend. And I think that goes also back to the investment part of it. It's hard to compare apples to apples because I'm pretty detailed at keeping track of what we spend and what we put into the house, was a fix upper, et cetera. But most people don't have a tally of that, especially the longer you live in there.
Yeah.
So it's a lot easier to just say, oh, I bought it for X, I sold it for X, therefore I made money. It was a great investment. And I think we get caught up in that. The more we hear it, the more we see it. Houses are literally staying on the market 2-3 days, and they're going for pretty exorbitant values.
Well, yeah. Well, I think there's two things. One is comparing if you are going to try to do some kind of apples to apples, I think it's, you want to figure out what are your all-in costs to buying the thing that you have your eye on. I do think that it's helpful to actually have a place that you have in mind and then do a comparison. If we're saying buy versus rent, I'm just going to assume, let's say this is me, which I do this all the time. So let's say that it's me and I have a general idea of where I want to be, kind of what I want how big I want the house to be, whatever. I have certain criteria. Let's say that I find something that meets those criteria and it will have a price, right? So then I can work backwards and I can say, it's going to cost me this. First of all, the mortgage is known. I pretty much know what the mortgage is going to be. And I know that it's going to be fixed. It's not going to change a whole lot as long as I obviously get a 30-year fix. My taxes and my insurance is not fixed necessarily, but you can do a pretty good educated guess. The taxes are probably a little bit easier to do. The insurance it depends, but you can get a rough estimate of what that's going to be. That last part, like Dave said, is the maintenance. And if you just take the value, multiply it by 1.5%, and then just divide it by 12, it will give you a monthly rough estimate of what it costs. If you're buying a brand new house, maybe it's not 1.5, at least not in the beginning. If you're buying a 100-year-old house, maybe it's 3. Like, it depends. You give you a range, but 1.5, I think, will give you a rough estimate of what it's going to be. If you add all those things up and it gives you a monthly payment of X, and like for myself, if I'm renting, then I can compare. Well, I'm paying this much in rent, I'm paying this much, and I would be paying this much to live in this place and all the things that come along with it, how much down payment, all the investment I'd have to make. Then I can say, oh, for this place, that sounds great. I think that's actually a good idea. It meets all my criteria. I really like it. This is something I really want to look into doing. Lately, I've gone through and done that same exercise, and I almost always come up with, no way. I can't. There's the difference between what I'm doing now and that is small, and all the extra stuff that comes along with doing it. And I'd be paying double or something what I'm doing now, or sometimes more than that of what I'm doing now. And I just can't take the next step to do it. So that's how I make the decision between the two things. Now, at some point that would change. So that's how I'd make the decision. But like Dave said, even I'm pretty good at keeping track of my expenses. I'm also comfortable saying, well, if I pay this much, I'm going to be giving up this. And a lot of times what that is well, maybe it's more often than not, it's like some kind of travel. And I just don't want to do that right now. Maybe that changes in the future, but right now I don't. But I'm trying to let my objectives lead my actions instead of the other way around. You're doing the shortcut of renting, throwing money away, therefore buy, that's just the action leading the objective so it's trying to do it the other way around. Hopefully,
to put you on the spot, do you and Jessica have, and you can decline this, but do you have other outside forces that kind of weigh in on this decision between we shouldn't be renting and we should be? Because I feel like I've seen that multiple times. In other words, it's not just rates are great, so therefore I should look at buying a home, but it's also, this is like when I didn't meet Melissa till I was 30, right? And growing up to that, my mom might not remember, but she would always say, you're not getting any younger. You want to have kids. and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I'm 30. I don't have to, and I think some of that's generational and not to go down that road, but there were definitely some outside pressures to be like, okay, maybe I should be like,
yeah, true,
thinking of settling down. So have you experienced that with just like as a renter?
Oh, for sure. There's a lot of, well, there's a few things. There's always, especially when, if you start kind of getting your affairs in order and you start doing like planning and you're doing financial planning stuff and you're saving your money. I mean, that really is, as sad as it is, that's kind of a countercultural thing. That's not the norm. Most people are not really taking care of their money and making, doing the whole objectives, leading their actions. And they're not doing these things. It's most people are not doing that. When you're doing that, you are the oddball out in some sense. So there is, like we already mentioned, there's kind of a cultural, like renting is throwing your money away. And if you're renting, therefore you're just kind of an idiot. I hear that stuff and I definitely don't want to think of myself as a moron, but it's hard to like constantly push that off. Like, oh, cause you do start questioning yourself and thinking, well, maybe I am a moron and I'm just telling myself stories and it really is the best thing to do. How could it be wrong? All of these other people are doing it. So that's very difficult. That's pressure you put on yourself. That's just your internal, I'm following the crowd kind of a natural thing that's hard to not do.
Right.
Yes, there's also the external pressure from people on the outside that will, they just say, well, why are you doing that? You should be doing this. Like, and a lot of times that's because that's what they're doing and they want you to do the same thing they're doing to justify their decisions. You could make that point with that's the whole video in itself. But so yes, there's definitely external pressure if you're doing something that's somewhat countercultural, but there's also you feel the internal pressure of, am I really being dumb? And I'm just telling myself stories about what I should be doing. So it's constant. This is a constant topic. Just going to talk about it constantly. It's a constant topic. And the good thing is we have some interplay between each other and we can kind of pro and con it to each other as often as we have to do it. And at least recently, we've always come down on the let's just keep doing what we're doing because we are trying to do some other stuff too. But that would change. I do want to keep an open mind that I would do something different later, but I would try to do it in a way that I keep those other things in mind. So
it sounds as though it's there's two components. One, what are we trying to accomplish?
Yes.
And based on where we're at in our lives, what's the time frame? What's most important today? That's one component. It sounds like you guys have done a ton of talking about that and continually, which I think is great. And then the second component is financially, what does it look like? What would it look like? And do those things match up? Because at some point, people, again, I know I'm picking on interest rates being so low, but we've talked about this. Interest rates are low. Values of homes are crazy. If I get on Zillow and look at my property, and I do this all the time, it blows my mind that somebody would pay some of these prices, right? But if rates start to go back up,
yes,
normally what we see is the value comes down because the majority of us we have to borrow money to get it. And we look at what's the payment going to be based on that rate. So if my rate goes up, my payment's going to be higher. I can afford less, so it's going to pull down the value. It's not that linear, but pretty close. But you guys have those conversations and are looking at it, and it sounds as though for right now you're making the right decision because the objectives are being met and they exceed any of financial incentive or I'd be better off doing it this way.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's also, the other thing that comes up a lot that I do want to address, I hear this all the time too, is if you buy a house, it's like a form of forced savings, right? So if you pay your mortgage, in a sense, you're saving really the principal payment. That is really what you're paying down. That's really the part that you're saving. The rest of it is just expenses, your taxes and your insurance and your maintenance and all those things are, throwing money away, as some people would say, those are things that you're just not getting back. Paying the mortgage down is really, I suppose, the savings part of what you're getting, which is somewhat true. I mean, you will at some point have paid the mortgage off, assuming you stay in the same place and you're not always, doing the lifestyle upgrade constantly where you buy one and then a bigger and a bigger and a bigger. In that case, you don't. Most people don't have their mortgages paid off. I looked the other day and it was something like 25% of people have their mortgages paid off. So the vast majority of people don't have paid off mortgages. So it is a way of forced savings for sure, but it tends to be a pretty low rate of return on your forced savings, which we've already talked about. It doesn't matter. It's just a consumption, but there is some form of forced savings. If you're renting, which at this point anyways, it's a little bit cheaper than buying something I think comparable to what you're renting. If you were taking everything above and beyond your rent and spending all of it, well, sure. I think if you don't have the discipline to save your money any other way, then yeah, I guess force yourself into doing it. But you don't have to do that. You can rent and also save. You just have to be a little bit disciplined about it. And then you can save your money in things that get you a little bit better return, at least over time, compared to what you would pay on your principal. So I guess it is, yeah, there is a forced savings, but that doesn't, if you need to be forced to do something, I suppose, but as long as you don't need to be forced to do it. And if you just a little bit of discipline, you can still save money and grow it a little bit quicker than you probably would have paying a mortgage off or something.
It's interesting you say that, because I wonder if there's like this, interior belief that it's such a good investment.
Yes.
But maybe that's driven by the fact that, as you mentioned, you kind of ratchet the lifestyle, right? I make more, I can afford more, therefore I get a bigger house. I now have a family, I need more space. I want to be on the water because I love the boat. And so you kind of ratchet that thing up. You're less mindful of saving discretionary money because you're buying the house. And so therefore you are putting more pressure on your home to be an investment, because yes, that's really the first and foremost thing that you're putting additional money to. I can see that definitely happening and saying, oh man, this thing's got to grow by 5, 6, 7%. And then I'll, sell it and I'll have, my retirement's my house type of thing. We've heard that before too.
Yeah. Yeah. But the idea that the equity in your house is going to be the thing that you retire off on is probably, it's just highly unlikely. It's expensive to get that equity out of your house, no matter how you do it. Sell it, well, you got to pay realtor commissions, and of course you have to live somewhere, so you'd have to do something. I suppose if your house is going up in value, generally the things in the immediate area are going up in value, and typically nationwide, there's there's a little bit of kind of arbitrage between if you're selling a home in New York, let's say, or Chicago, and you're moving to, St. Petersburg, I guess, for those that don't know where we are, or anywhere in like Central Florida. Well, sure, there's a little bit of difference. Maybe you can get something, but that's less true all the time. So it's gotten expensive down here as much as it's expensive other places, and there's all these other considerations versus property taxes and all these things you have to pay.
Yeah.
So generally, it's just expensive. It's expensive to get your money out of equity in your house. Where are you going to live? You can do reverse mortgages and you can refi your house, and there's just a lot of things, but it's hard to get that out. It's hard to get the equity and live off of it. And usually it's not going to be enough no matter what to maintain your lifestyle. So you're going to have some kind of outside investment to have any kind of independence at some point, and putting the money into the house typically is not going to be the way to do it. Right.
So first and foremost, if you're thinking about buying a house, if you've never done it, you're currently renting, this, I guess, is advice to Jack for as a refresher is, what are the objectives, right? What are you and Jessica trying to accomplish? What's most important? And start there.
Exactly. That's with everything. I know we've beat this to death almost, but your objectives should be driving your decisions, not the other way around. And you will find yourself, if you don't do that, I think sometimes what will happen is you'll make decisions and then you'll start justifying to yourself why you made those decisions. And instead of having your actions matching your objectives, you'll start to jam your objectives into your actions and say, well, I did this, but yeah, it's fine. I can sacrifice that. If there's one thing that we're going to be good at, it's going to be convincing ourselves that we did the right thing. So if you're going to make the decision to do this, my suggestion would be is give the decision proper attention.
Yeah.
Really, really think it through of what you're going to do, because once you do it, whatever that is, especially if you buy a house because it's hard to get out of, the self-justification machine is going to go to work. And you're going to, at that point, you're going to start telling yourself that it was great. And it'd be hard if you don't put the time in and it ends up not going the way you thought, I suppose. You're going to start justifying it to yourself. And then you get that kind of, that pit in your stomach type feeling where Dave's lights went off.
Yeah. Got it. They're back on.
So
we're paying the bills. It's just the motion.
Right. So just giving the decision proper attention, because once you get into it, it's going to be hard. It's hard to back out of it, even if it ends up being a bad decision, I suppose. It's hard to get out of that. So just give it, because you'll be really up to the pros and cons ahead of time. I mean, a lot of people will think things through before they make a decision, as long as they take the time. But once you do it, you're just going to start convincing yourself that it was right. And you end up in this position. And we've had this happen many times when we talk to people, is the undoing it is very difficult to do, especially the longer that you're doing that.
The other takeaway that I would say is try not to go into it thinking it's got to be a great investment.
Yes.
Because it doesn't. As a homeowner, if I've said this in other videos that, we, for all intents and purposes, plan on staying in our house a long time. At the end of the day, if I happen to be diligent enough to tally up all of the expenses, what we bought it for, what we sold it for, and that's a wash, a complete zero, me personally, I'm going to say, great. Look at all the things it's allowed us to do between family and friends and our lifestyle and the way we like things. And I don't really care. If it makes the money, great. If it doesn't, I'm okay with that too. Maybe I get dumb lucky and it is beneficial, but at the same time, that's not deriving why we're in our house. And so I would encourage you or other people that you're talking to don't view it as investment. If you want to talk about real estate and as investment, and I'm sure we'll do another chat on this, reach out, because as Jack mentioned earlier, it's relatively easy to do some math to say, okay, this is my net return. Kevin just did this for clients of ours that were looking at rental real estate, and that too could also be a preference as opposed to math, but we can walk you through that. So those are, I think, the two biggest things: objectives and priorities, and then not viewing it as an investment. It's an expense. It's going to provide something to fuel my lifestyle, my desires, or my environment, but it doesn't have to be I'm going to make a ton of money by buying this house and retire on it.
Absolutely.
So Anything else that you can think of?
I think that's it. I would say, I just agree with everything you said, is not putting pressure on yourself to make some great investment decision, giving it proper attention before you make decisions one way or the other, and matching your actions up with your objectives. And I think you'll be just fine.
Perfect. Well, thanks for tuning in for another Tuesday chat with Avid. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next week, Jack.
All right. See you.